Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Robinson, or the Play Typer guy, as my son calls me, and I'm excited today. My guest is Ruby McConnell, author here in Portland, Oregon, with me, and um, just this really interesting person who I was very excited agreed to speak with me. So Ruby is a writer, geologist, and adventurous. And her work focuses on nature, the environment, and the relationship between landscape and the human experience. She's the author of A Woman's Guide to the Wild, the definitive outdoor guide for anyone who identifies as a woman or just loves women, as I do. And her writing has appeared in publications such as Grain Literary Journal, Oregon Humanities Magazine, and Mother Earth News, where a very good friend of mine used to write. And she was awarded the Oregon Literary Arts Fellowship in 2016. And her current book is Ground Truth, part natural history, part memoir and essays, which I also really enjoyed and highly recommend. Her books are available online at Powell's Books, IndieBound, Amazon, and booksellers large and small everywhere. I'll have links below in both the YouTube and the show notes for the podcast. So let's just hop right into it. Welcome, Ruby. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's just, your experience I found so interesting of a woman, a scientist, a lover of nature, and how you sort of got involved in geology and just some of the issues you confronted because, you know, as a people of color and women in general, it's not surprising. It's the reality. A lot of spaces aren't open to us for some reason. Like they assume that we should not be there. And if you could tell us a little bit about your journey becoming a geologist and author and all around nature aficionado.
Yeah, sure. From the viewpoint of 2023, I think it's widely recognized now that particularly outdoor spaces, and particularly in the American West, are and have historically been largely the domain of kind of the white male privileged subset. But in the 1990s, when I was a teenager and a young 20s person, that wasn't widely recognized. And I grew up in Portland and was pretty insulated and insular and spent a lot of time in the outdoors. And that led me into environmental studies, and which I studied at the University of Oregon. And I had a lot of enthusiasm for it. I had a sense of really wanting to study something that like took me outside. And as I got into my environmental studies degree, I discovered that things like geology were classes where they would take you camping. And for people like me that didn't have a car, didn't have a lot of money, didn't have access to a lot of the gear, it was kind of like a way into the outdoors. But much like the outdoors, taking geology classes and sort of starting to progress into geology meant that I had to progress into sort of hard science classes, which was something that I had a lot of intimidation around and hadn't had a lot of success with in high school and kind of shied away from. And I had this amazing and life-changing experience in an undergraduate geology class when a graduate student came in and she was subbing for the professor, and she hadn't been given any time to prep. She came in and said, "I'm a woman in science." She was a woman of color. And she said, "I'm going to spend the hour today talking about how I ended up in science and how I ended up in a PhD program. And why the women in this class should know that if you want to be a researching scientist, you can and should." And she had started out as she had gotten to volcanology. She studied volcanoes, and she'd gotten into volcanology through welding. She was a welder, and she had questions about material science that she couldn't find the answers to just, through her practice of welding. And that led her into the study of volcanoes. And at the end of that hour, she said, "Anyone who's interested in doing research should come and talk to me and I will help you. So I went and said that I was interested, and she did help me. She sent me to one of the female professors at the university who gave me an opportunity to do research. And I kept showing up and I kept showing up and I kept showing up. And eventually was offered a really great project working on Mount St. Helens, which for anyone who's a volcano enthusiast knows it's like really kind of a big deal to get to study. And that single professor insisted that I change my major to geology and led me into the study of geology in general, which was wonderful. And I followed her up with another amazing mentor at the university, at Northern Arizona University, another strong woman who was dedicated to bringing women into what was a male-dominated field. And so when I was in school, it was like spectacular geology in spectacular places with these like fearless, fierce feminist women that were like, and now I'm going to go to Antarctica. And now I'm going to, it was like, wow, like this is so great. Like it was proof that you could do whatever you wanted to do, even if it was a male dominated field. And I got out of graduate school and got a job as a working geologist. And it was nothing like my school experience. It was completely male dominated. And the story that I tell people is I would show up and I was like, so green. And I had like a shiny hard hat that didn't have any dirt or scratches on it. My pigtails, my hair was long and it didn't fit underneath my hard hat. And so I'd like wear it in pigtails. So I looked like this, like, it was like, and the hard hat was like super big on my head because it's designed, all of it's designed for men, right? It's like your gloves are too big. The truck is too big. You have to like hop out of it and like jump down. And you'd get there and these guys would be like, they said a geologist was coming. And you're like, yeah, I'm the geologist. Hey, geologist, I'm here, totally. And they're like, no, you're half a geologist. And at first, I demurred. And then I learned to say, cool, we can talk about whether or not I'm a whole geologist or a half a geologist. We can talk about whether or not you want a different geologist to come out, but I'm charging you $150 an hour, regardless of your views on whether or not I fit the bill for a geologist. And that usually worked. But that attitude was so pervasive. And just those little things like, why can't I get gloves from my company that fit me? Why can't I, like the shovel handles are too long for someone my size because all of the guys that I work with are 6 feet tall and they have the leverage to do this. And their attitude is that, like I'm not as good with a shovel. And it was like, I'm great with a shovel. The shovel is too long for me. The leverage doesn't work. The physics of this is different for me to get my job done. This isn't me. This is physics that I'm fighting against. And so, just that experience and was what really made me recognize that it wasn't just geology. It was kind of all of the outdoor experiences and anything that it was such, it's supposed to be a man's world. And I felt like I was proof that that wasn't true. And I thought that if other women are having these kinds of experiences, then it's probably putting them off of cultivating a really positive and beneficial relationship with the outdoor world. And that can't be good for the environment and it can't be good for women. So I thought I need to write a book that gives women the skill set and the confidence to go outside and stay there and have the experiences, good and bad, and take charge of your experience. And so it's sort of predicated on this notion that everyone's outdoor experience is unique and valid. And so that's the baseline for all of my work since then.
Thank you so much for that. And it's interesting because I know that has been somewhat of a narrative. Like the outdoors is where men go to get away from women or get away from it all or stuff like, these sort of really bad cliches that aren't true, but is out there, similar to like Black people don't like to go camping and stuff like that, which is often rooted in access issues other than some sort of genetic difference, that we might that isn't true at all as well. So, your book, what I found is fascinating, was sort of like breaking that barrier, sort of explaining, well, this isn't true, and here's how you can kind of enjoy these spaces and everything. Can you tell us a bit about how the process of writing your first book, The Woman's Guide to the Outdoors, and kind of what your process was with that and what you hope to achieve with it?
Yeah, I mean, I really I had no idea what I was doing. I had written a master's thesis. I wrote reports. I knew, I knew how to write, but I knew nothing of the publishing industry. And I think it was really good for me to not know. I really, I did it completely backwards. It turns out that most nonfiction is written proposal first. You write a book proposal, you shop that proposal to an agent, that agent sells it to a publisher, and then you write the book. I wrote the whole book and then was like, what am I supposed to do with this? And so my earliest notes on The Woman's Guide, they date back to about 10 years before the book came out. I was sort of thinking about this concept. And when the recession hit and everybody lost their job, and I transitioned to another phase of my life, I decided to make the writing of this book important and pressing, and get it done. And so when I reached a point where I felt like, I did the outline and I sort of thought about, like, why do we need an outdoor guide for women when building a fire is totally the same for men and women?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what really is the difference? And ultimately I came to the conclusion that there isn't one other than voice and perspective, and so I had to sort of really think about what's the tone of the average sort of male typical outdoor book, and what did I want to bring that was different to that. So I never looked at it. If you look at it on Amazon, it's listed under survival guides. And I'm like, wow, because my whole point is because I don't really think that we should have to feel like we're just surviving outside. I think
yes.
I don't want to lash my own snowshoes together and like live off of trout that I've caught with my bare hands, that's just not part of it. And so I really, I was focused on tone. And then at some point I needed like more time and a little bit more encouragement. And I actually did a Kickstarter for this book. And this was kind of in like the early days of Kickstarters, and it was successful. And then based on the strength of that Kickstarter, I did manage to like get the book written. So I had other authors that were helpful in my early days that I just sort of stumbled into and said, you should take this to a regional press, take it to a small press. So I found Sasquatch Books, which is out of Seattle, sent it to their slush pile and got pulled out of the slush pile, which happens to absolutely no one. It doesn't happen. But the woman who was reading the slush pile was a kayaker and understood the issue. And the editor who eventually picked up the book had just moved to Seattle from New York and was in this position. She's like, everyone keeps asking me to do all these outdoor things, and I'm just like completely ill-equipped. So it was just really like great timing. And so that, Sasquatch picked up the book. They had just become a part of Random House. And so there was great support for the book when it came out. And it kind of was the thing that allowed me to transition to be a full-time writer. It was amazing. I feel very lucky.
And you had spoken, about the hard hat situation, right? Like or the shovel, the pickaxe, like the physics being different. People assuming, well, it's not it's not that I can't do this, it's just that you've structured it for a man. Is that the case? Had you found that the case in some of like outdoors work? Like there's sort of barriers and sort of presumption that anyone doing this, like some of the supplies you would need or anything, is sort of geared towards men and perhaps off-putting. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, it's all pink. That's how I know that outdoor gear is meant for me. I walk into an outdoor store and I'm like, where's the pastel colors? Where's the pink clearance rack? Because that's what's meant for women. The other, and like also, you know, like the women, and then also the women's clothing itself tends to like be non-inclusive, right? So you have to be like this big, like teeny tiny in order to fit into the double XL. So like, you know, you want to be a normal sized woman and go on a normal sized walk and just like not freeze. You have to have like super low self-esteem while you're doing that.
Yeah, that's
and it is a barrier, you know. Because what gear companies are signaling is that not only if you're a woman and you don't fit the stereotype of like what we think your body should be like, then you're not intended to be outside. And there's a group called Fat Girls Hiking that I believe is based out of Portland that knocks that right out of the water. They are amazing. And so there's that. There's also what I call like the masculine outdoor hazing of women. And I talk about like the bear myth, you know, where it's like, sure, you can come on this camping trip, but like if you're menstruating, you're going to be eaten by bear, or like I'm going to have to defend you from the bear that you draw to us because you're menstruating. Which is
I'm sorry. So all those sitcoms from the 80s were lying to us.
Do you want to know what attracts bear? Is the meat on the stick that the dude next to you is roasting, the giant big poop that he takes in the morning. I know, I'm sorry. I don't know if your podcast usually has quite this.
No. You are elevating me.
But I mean, like legitimately, like I'm not going to draw a bear, you know, but like the bacon and like the, you know, like the can of beans, like all of those sort of Western tropes of like, I'm going to eat like a bunch of jerky, or, you know, that like kind of comes with like stereotypical manness in the outdoors. That's going to draw your bear. I mean, I have had men come to book events and argue with me. They're like the only man for like a 3/4 mile radius in this book, because like they're at a Woman's Guide to the Wild book event, and they stand up and they're like, now I'll tell you what though, you really are going to draw a bear with that menstruation. I mean, they can smell you. And I'm like, sir, let me direct you to the fact that the National Park Service actually had to conduct studies on this because it was such a pervasive myth. They actually have like an entire page dedicated to debunking this myth. But I've come to learn that it's not just misogyny. It's also part fantasy. It's like, you'll draw the bear and I will save you. Right. So it's not just misogyny. It also has to do, I think, with the expectations and mythologies that that are put on men themselves. Like I've become a little bit more generous about it over the years as like time has gone on in terms of my perspective, that I recognize more now that there are strange expectations put on men in the outdoors as well, and that those aren't necessarily comfortable either.
Yeah, I don't want to wrestle a bear, right? Like that's the expectation, and it's like, well, oh my God, I can't do that, right? Like I'm supposed to be this Grizzly Adams, to really date myself, this Grizzly Adams type character, and I'm not. I just want to kind of have a nice walk and enjoy the outside, but without all this stuff on it. It almost feels, for me, it always felt like you need to become a totally different person to enjoy the outdoors. It's like, well, I can't. I've got to get. I don't own plaid. I don't like all this sort of stuff, right? Is this these, which is all myth. It's not true, right?
Right, and that's exactly it. And I've had couples. I've had couples show up to book events, and they're like, you've like saved a part of our marriage, because you've sorted out the fact that like we always argue about the fire, because like it's like he won't let me build the fire and he doesn't know how to build a fire, and like we argue over it, and he's like, well, but it's my job to build the fire, and she's like, why don't you let me practice the life-saving skill? I like doing it. And they just never talked about it, and they were both sort of functioning from this like, here's the expectations. And you raise a really important point, which is like when sitcoms run out of topics, they just go to like, well, let's send them camping and it'll be a disaster and everybody can talk about how they hate it, and then like something awful will happen and they'll be like, we're never doing that again.
That is pretty much the arc, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like it doesn't matter what show you're watching, it'll come up, and I think that's a shame. I think it's a shame.
And it's sort of an interesting. So combining the sort of hard sciences with the outdoors is fascinating. Someone who enjoy like the science of things, is right, like the being outside and all of that, and how you survive and everything is just very fascinating. But you kind of write about it in a way that's not off-putting, because when I was in college, like many people who were in journalism and the arts, they used to call it rocks for jocks. So really, I took, okay, well, this is a science I can handle, right? I'll take a geology course, and even that was a bit, oh my god, I can memorize rocks. Oh my god, and but I actually had tried to do astronomy because I was really into planets, and then they sort of drop Newtonian physics on you, and I was like, oh, whoa, this is I do Star Wars. Like maybe I'm not prepared for this, but yeah, I mean, you kind of give us a sense of let's just enjoy the outdoors. It's fun, and do you think there's sort of levels of engagement with it, like for people who just want to spend a day, have a walk, then go to a cabin and sleep overnight, and then like the people who really do want to quote unquote rough it? Do you sort of acknowledge that those are the different pathways to it, right?
Oh yeah, I mean that's the thing. Everyone's experience is unique and valid. If you want to sit in a chair in a quiet place and watch the still water of a lake, that's a valid outdoor experience. You want to climb to the top of a mountain and feel like you have conquered that. You want to be out there for exercise. Like some people are just into adrenaline-based activities that happen to occur outside. I personally do not do activities that involve hurdling. I don't hurdle down things, through things, across things, over things. I don't get tied to things and flung down things. I don't do those kinds of things. Have I done some dangerous things in the outdoors? Sure. Have I gone to backcountry places? Sure. Have I flown through, active eruption plumes? Sure. Done some of those things. I also really just like to bird watch. and what's beautiful about geology, and we called it rocks for jocks too. And gosh, it gets a bad rap because geology is such an elegant and deeply integrated science. And so what I love about geology, particularly as a field geologist, is that, physics and biology and math and chemistry all come to bear in the shaping of the land and the creation of the surface of the earth. And in fact, what geology is, rather than being separate from any of those sciences, is a written record in the landscape of how all of those forces have converged over time. And so in being an outdoors person and also understanding geology, it allows you to go out into the landscape and read the history of the planet from, cliffside or from the water side. And it, so, like, yeah, people, you say rocks and people go, just like either their eyes droop, but really it's the braille of the land. And I think that it really enriches our understanding of the natural world. And that was really what I was trying to get at in Ground Truth, was to illuminate, those are personal essays, and really I see them as essays about the land, using my own life as a metaphor to illustrate the ways that our lives are really connected to the natural world, which I think is super important in this digital age.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. My wife is really into hiking and being outdoors, and that was something. Our son has mobility challenges, uses a walker. He likes being out there with his mom, and it's a thing he likes to share. And I think your book also is very good about trying to how we can share this with our son, who's going to access it slightly differently. They're, trying to find, whenever we travel, sometimes it's sort of like, how do you find the sort of accessible campground or accessible trail? I mean, that's just enough that someone can, on a walker, can again spend an hour or so on and then come back to. Because that's very important. I think it's a sort of part of my wife's experience. She wants to share with him about being told that's impossible. Because sometimes people will say, "Oh, that's impossible," right?
Yeah, and it's not. And there's gosh, so Oregon has a really robust outdoor school program, and I was a student at the outdoor school program, and then a teen leader and a staff member. And one of the things that program has always been dedicated to is making sure that all bodies have access to that program. And Oregon and California in particular, I think, have done a really great job through their state parks programs of making sure that like those areas have all human accessible trails. I remember there's one trail in particular. Gosh, I wish I could remember where it is specifically, in the redwoods, that they have like a tactile experience, ropes that you follow, so that people who can't take in the beauty of that particular area with their eyes are able to experience it more through touch and sound safely, without necessarily having to rely on a guide, and they can have independence as well. Outdoor time outside has study after study after study talks about the health benefits, mental and physical, of time in the outdoors. And so the more that we can do to make it feel and be easy and accessible for everyone with every kind of body and every kind of background, I think that what we're doing is elevating human health and wellness. And I think that we're in a time where like maybe we're a little sick of hearing about public health and human health and wellness, but there are things that we can do that are simple, like making sure that there's access to the outdoors, that can really benefit people. And I think it's an important thing to keep at the forefront of public policy and choices that we make around funding as well.
I know during the pandemic, for a lot of folks, that became sort of a retreat because public spaces were no longer accessible. As someone, I'd spent most of my adult life in New York. I thought of myself a city person. And then I was, even we were living in Portland when it happened, but we were fortunate enough that we were in Seaside, Oregon, during it. And so it was a little bit better. But at the time I felt like, oh my God, let's just sell everything and go somewhere and lots of space, and the sea, I can see a river or something from my backyard and whatever. And I don't know if your experience is similar. It felt like a sense of almost kind of wanting to engage in that because it felt like suddenly everything I loved about cities felt dangerous, which is not, historically speaking, is sort of true. Like if you read about Tudor England, the kings and the rich people were like, oh my God, if you go in the city, you're going to die, because literally that could happen. You're going to catch the plague, and the sanitation was terrible. And so where people of means went was often to enjoy the countryside or whatever. So it is sort of thing of where, what I was getting at there is sort of the idea of like, it needs to be somewhat of a shared experience, like to be accessible publicly. I feel like, it was terrible when all our national parks were being kind of closed and then we couldn't access them at that time. And, was that a challenge for you, for someone who likes to get out and get out there, to sort of not be able to go into these spaces?
I technically live in Eugene. I grew up in Portland, but I technically live in Eugene, and I do that because Eugene is basically 2.5 hours away from anything in Oregon. It's so central. And honestly, I'm a full-time writer, so I don't have like a workplace that I go to, and my life changed very little during that period of time that I call the quieting of the world. And in fact, the major change that happened was I got kind of pushed out of outdoor spaces that I would normally go to, which were now overrun with a lot of people who perhaps had not read my book. And perhaps, we're lacking a certain skill set, or maybe some trail etiquette and best practices, but also clearly needed the outdoor access. And so what I found, and I was lucky to be able to do this, and part of this is just having an outdoor skill set makes this so much easier. I was able to go to places that other people weren't. So I shifted and spent a lot of time in, off trail, in like more remote areas, lots of logging roads rather than hiking trails, as they tend to be quieter. If you do encounter someone, you had the 6-foot distance. Like I'm very comfortable navigating without having to use a trail as a marker. And getting myself back home. I'm still here. I don't necessarily encourage people to do that because, but I have that skill set and was able to do that. And so for me, it was actually like a deep period of like going to a lot of places that I may not have been to previously because perhaps they were a little bit farther out or a little bit less accessible. And I really cherished that time. To be honest. And since then have seen, it's like you could hear the world opened back up and you could hear a sucking noise come out of the natural areas as the parking lots disappeared. And I sort of have this sense that it's like, if it was something that I did during the pandemic, I am never doing it again. I'm never watching Tiger King again. I'm never making another loaf of sourdough, never going on another walk. And I think that that's one that, maybe the Tiger King, that's a good choice. But like the going outside, I think that that's something people should reconsider picking back up.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's something for me, that space or that quieting, as you put it, is a great way of putting it. I felt like it stuck with me. I was kind of like, oh, I kind of enjoy this. I don't need to actually be in a city to feel vibrant and whatever, right? I can be alone with my thoughts in a way, and it's very peaceful and nice. You as someone who grew up in Portland, and I was reading in your book, you allude to sort of the changes in Portland and Oregon in general, like the from lumber and that's something when I was writing about the recent gubernatorial race. Bessie Johnson, one of the candidates, was had a history in the lumber industry and so forth. And it's just very fascinating of how that's a big deal, like the sort of the, it's a major industry, but also its impact on the area in general. And do you mind kind of speaking a little bit to sort of that change? Because a lot of it was going on during a period where, again, as a New Yorker, I'm reading about Portland's golden age, right? I'm reading about the golden age, but at the same time, perhaps that's not exactly what is occurring, or at least it's more complex than that. There's a lot of development, and there's sort of perhaps a negative impact to that development.
Yeah. So just, for like background, like, Portland's called Stumptown for a reason, because in order to clear the way for development, they had to cut down ancient, beautiful old growth trees. And really, the role, my perspective, my opinion is that the role that Oregon has played in the history of the United States is largely as fuel for the economy, whether that fuel be trees or salmon or mining or water. Oregon is the place that the United States, one of the places that the United States has consistently turned to for abundance to fuel a growth-based economy. It was wildly inaccessible. It's hard, it's hard homesteading. It was exclusionary. It didn't, so it was exclusionary and isolationist. And then also inaccessible. So, it's easy to conceive of the early history of Oregon as being sort of several hundred years behind the rest of the history of the United States in terms of development. And so by the 1980s, what had happened was in the 1970s and 1972, the EPA was created. The first Earth Day had happened in 1971. There was a new environmental ethic that the boomers were bringing in with back to the land and alternative fuels and energy sources. And by the time the 1980s came around, that ethic had kind of reached a head in Oregon, where really the trees were coming down faster than the trees were coming down in the Amazon rainforest. And the forests in Oregon in their original state are some of the most biologically diverse in the world, and have some of the most highest density of plant diversity and just plant matter and living matter on the planet. And so that burgeoning environmental ethic ran into the realities of running out of trees. And then people near Brighton Bush Hot Springs outside of Salem found spotted owls, which are an endangered species. And the whole world in Oregon kind of blew up. And what you ended up with is what now people talk about as the timber wars, and I call it kind of the environmental reckoning of Oregon, where at that point, Oregon had to decide what's our identity. Are we a hard scrabble, independent, ranching, extraction, logging state, or are we going to mature, as many of our cities are starting to, and become an intellectual center, do something else with ourselves? And it was an identity crisis. And it's an unresolved identity crisis, which plays out in our politics. It's why so many things in Oregon, win or lose by a 1 or 2% margin. And it's why Portland and Eugene, these large liberal urban centers, often carry that 2% margin against the votes of the rural population, which are really still rooted in that way of life.
It feels like such a, if you travel, for those who've been out into to parts of rural Oregon, it's lovely and it's beautiful. It just feels like a different state in certain ways, or, and that's a generalization, but in certain senses of, it's almost like, again, if you were to take like the idea of like Texas and California are smushed together, but California is just enough to tip, to kind of suppress Texas, that would seem weird, right? But to people, because, oh yeah, those are very different, what we think of stereotypically different cultures. And that seems to have been what kind of has occurred in Oregon over the past few decades. But what's I found fascinating, kind of monitoring the recent gubernatorial race, and you're someone who does such a great job of busting myths, so perhaps this is another myth, but but a lot of Portlanders have told me, and Oregonians in general, there's a time where kind of an environmentally forward Republican from Oregon was not unusual. It was just like, okay, well, here's ways that I'm a Republican or a conservative, but I also believe in conservation and so forth, and the outdoors, and I'm going to vote for things that are environmentally forward. I would perhaps join with a Democrat from California or from New York to vote for an environmental bill. And then it sort of shifted to where it's called sort of a nationalization of our politics, where a Republican is going to talk like a Republican everywhere. Like you're going to go on Tucker Carlson, you're going to say the same things no matter where you're from. And so that was that sense where it looked like potentially Christine Drazan could win. There was that sense of, well, she's kind of talking like Ted Cruz or any other Republican. It's not, I don't get that sort of, as you were saying, that sort of Oregon, this is Oregon and we have this respect for the outdoors and the areas and environment. I wasn't sort of getting that, nor from obviously Betsy Johnson either. So that was sort of a weird time. That was a weird time.
And I agree with that assessment. I mean, that's, this is where the greater Idaho movement is coming from. The people who want to like cut off part of the state and join Idaho because they believe that their ideology more closely matches that of Idaho. And at the heart of this, I go back to people's relationship with the natural world is broken or disconnected or non-existent. Because in the 80s, you've got Republicans, and in the 90s, you've got Republicans that like also have an environmental ethic because people were using the land. I mean, in the 80s and the 90s, the parking lots for all of these outdoor places were full to overflowing. And, like, you don't assign actionable value to something that you don't interact with and that you don't understand. Go out into Oregon and experience the landscape and then be like, meh, knock it down. Dig it up. It's largely impossible because it is spectacularly beautiful, and it touches people on a level that the best word that I have for it is it inspires an element of transcendence in the human experience. And people are permanently impacted by transcendent experiences and have some sense of connection and ownership to land and spaces where they can access those kinds of transcendent experiences. A lot of people that are Oregonians are not from Oregon and didn't go to outdoor school in the forests. They didn't grow up in the parks and the outdoor spaces. Their family traditions aren't rooted in these natural spaces. They, maybe they go to Silver Falls, maybe they go to Multnomah Falls, maybe they have some curated outdoor experiences that are like particularly curated now that there's so many people in Oregon. But the way of life, even for city people, in Oregon up until the 1990s and really the early aughts was very outdoor focused. And I think that, I was a canvasser for Greenpeace. I'd get guys that open the door, they'd see Greenpeace on my clipboard, and the first thing they'd say is, I like big chunks of whale in my tuna. Right? I mean, just like combative, right from the beginning. And I'm like, sir, I see from your bumper sticker that you're a hunter. And he's like, yeah, you got a problem with that? I was like, no, I think that we have shared interests, because the forest that I'm trying to protect is the habitat for the animals that you want to hunt. And if you want to continue your legacy of hunting, you know that you're going to have to protect that habitat. And a lot of times they'd write a check to Greenpeace at the end of the conversation. They certainly weren't screaming about whales by the time I left. I had similar experiences with women who would open the door and they would look at me kind of apologetically like, oh, honey. And they'd go, I'm pro-life. As if that would explain why they were going to say no to me, a Greenpeacer standing in front of them. And I was like, cool. I'm pro-life too. I'm just not limiting that to human life. Let me tell you why environmentalism is a pro-life stance. And let me tell you why it's a pro-human life stance. And sure enough, they'd write a check, or they wouldn't.
Yeah.
It wouldn't feel like we were on opposite sides. So some of it, I think, this is how I ended up writing the Woman's Guide, is you can't ask people to engage with climate change or other environmental issues if they have no experience of the environment. Who cares if you chuck that water bottle out the window if you don't walk through the fields that you chuck it in?
Yeah, and I'm not going to name names here, but just there's a lot of politicians, Democrats, the federal level, state level, who can't talk about this issue the way you just did. Like, there's such a relatability and just coalition building that you just described that seems like, how to put it, you're a normal human being. Like, often I will list something and it's just like, as a writer who just, who writes plays and something, I will hear someone talking about issues that are important to me. I support what this politician is saying, but it's like, this is a terrible script. Like, you don't sound like how a normal human being sounds. Whereas you just did. You should. Have you ever considered running for some of our office? Because we just need more people who sound like human beings.
Yeah, my goal is to sound like a human being. The goal of my writing is to be persuasive. And that's why I say, that Ground Truth wasn't. It happened to come out as personal essays, but. Like my editor would sometimes say, like, this essay, like, it leaves, I just want more of you in this essay. Like, I have an essay about the salmon. He's like, I just, I want more of your story. And I was like, I can't do it. He's like, why? I said, because this essay isn't about me. The salmon are not a metaphor for me in this essay. I am the metaphor for the salmon in this essay. And so you're going to get more salmon than you get of me, because I'm not actually talking about myself. What I'm trying to do is say, look at the ways that this landscape has intersected with my life. Look at the way that, like, the shape of the land itself can determine the way that we live, and has determined the way that we live. And then try to tell me that the day-to-day choices that we make regarding the natural world aren't going to have an impact on ourselves. Try to tell me that there's some other that we should be looking to. There's people with more power and more influence and more ability to affect change. But for anyone to think that they could possibly separate their own life experience from the natural world, regardless of, whether or not you live in a Manhattan apartment or you live in a cabin in the woods, it's just impossible. And you're impacted by the choices that everybody else makes, like the choices that people make in Manhattan and LA about the environment impact my air quality, impact my climate, impact how many trees come out of Oregon. So, the land itself is the common denominator. It is the intersectional issue that we are looking for, that can provide us with a foundation for coalition building. Exactly what you say. And I think that's why people work so hard to make sure that everybody thinks that if you go outside, you're going to have a terrible experience. I think that's why everybody works so hard to discount it. I think that's why the tropes about like the hippy dippy environmentalists are so potent and so consistent, because anything that has the possibility of bringing so many people together and affecting so much change is clearly dangerous to the status quo.
Oh yeah, and it's sort of and it's a certain identity. So again, to bring it into these tropes is the idea of the city slicker lady who meets the rugged man and they go camping. She doesn't fit, but by the end of it, she's embraced that world, but at the cost of the implicit cost, she's rejected the city world and all of that liberalism or whatever, and now she's going to embrace being a happy home, but you don't need to do that. So, because if you're a feminist, you're watching this, it's like, well, I don't want any part of that I don't want to be broke. I don't want to change who I am. It's like, well, no, you can, there's no reason. You don't have to enter this space on those terms. You can enter it as yourself, enjoy that, and then go and be your badass businesswoman, if that's who you are, whoever and yeah, so going back to what you said about the coalition building, it was just so fascinating you did that, because it is you meet a hunter. You're not going to convince someone to not hunt, and you're not going to convince someone to be, anti-abortion. They feel very strongly about that. However, they're still human beings who, okay, here's how I can bring this into something else that's important to me, which we go back to, or what the idea of what Oregon Republicans used to be. It's like, okay, well, I vote with Reagan on these issues, but I'm going to vote with Democrats on preserving the environment in certain ways. And I think that what we've seen, as you said, is like not allowing that coalition building. It's kind of like, this is your very rigid identity. And so this is who you have to be. And so you must reject everything else. And so I really appreciate you are, of course, breaking those myths and shutting them down. And I, again, thank you so much for your time. And again, I want to say the books you wrote are amazing. The links are downstairs, are in the YouTube and on the show notes for the podcast. Ground Truth is out now. Woman's Guide, or you can also purchase Pals, Indie Books, Amazon. Just really great. And the memoir writing especially is really good in Ground Truth. I kind of read it very quickly because it was really, really engaging. And I think it's an engaging memoir because you don't make it about you, a sort of this weird kind of twist, but that's the best memoir is in a way about how I'm the metaphor, as you say, for the larger place in the world. And I think you do such a great job of that in Ground Truth. So I highly recommend folks pick that up and other stuff you've done. What's next for you? Any other projects you're working on now you want to tell folks about?
Yeah, I have a book, Wilderness in the American Spirit, coming out a year, almost to the day, coming out in March of 2024, that has some great storytelling about the West, some untold stories that I think are really interesting, and talks about the human relationship to the land and how we got to now, and is hope-based and action-based for people who are looking for something that uplifts their spirit. And in preparation for that to come out, I have some excerpts and pieces that are based on the work of the book coming out. Some from Alta Journal. If you don't know Alta Journal of the West, they're great. Those will come out this spring and into the fall. And so, yeah, keep supporting me. Thank you so much for having me. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate your kind words about my work. And everyone should go outside.
Yes, on that note, that's I can't agree more. And for anyone who knows me, they will be shocked that I said that. But that's how I've changed recently. So this is the Play Typer Guy. You can find me on YouTube. Please like, share, subscribe. The podcast of the same name, available on Amazon, iTunes, Spotify. Please download, leave a review. And again, Ruby McConnell, thank you so much for joining us. Check out her work. And yes, see you outside. Take care.